Fellow Equatorians, good morning. This is Sabato with the Equatoria Advocacy Foundation. This morning, I would like to share with you certain facts. And as I finish sharing these facts, you will come to realize two things. One is that you, the Equatorians, are not brothers and sisters to the people who are coming from Bahar al-Ghazal and Upper Nile. And the second thing you'll come to realize is, in the same manner South Sudan had gone through a referendum in 2011, you could also go through a referendum anytime. Excuse me. Now, the facts that I would want to share with you is this. You see, as an Equatorian, there are certain important times in history that you should remember to help you understand yourself. First is the British-Congolese Free Trade Agreement of 1894, in which the current demographics of what is called the territory of the Equatoria, the remaining territory, that of course remained from what formerly used to be known as the Ladouens Enclave, has been leased out to Leopold II, who was running basically Congo at the time, especially the western side of Congo, because the eastern side was run by the Belgium. Leopold was also a Belgium, but he was having a project. That is very important for you to remember. And it is very important to remember that from 1894 until 1910, you have been with Congo. This is very important in history. 1894 to 1910, you have been with Congo. And it's also important to remember that on the other side, those whom you are calling brothers and sisters, all this time when you have been in Congo, they have been with the Sudan, and they have been the southern part of Sudan at the time. As a matter of fact, just 4 years after the British have entered into that agreement of what's called the British-Congolese Free Trade Treaty of 1894, just 4 years later, the France wanted to occupy Sudan, and the British objected to that, saying that Sudan belongs to them based on the Berlin Conference. And the France said, no, you are not in Sudan anyways. It was the Mahdiya who was running it. And so the British very quickly did send their general, Kitchener, who was running a garrison in Egypt at the time, followed the Nile and confronted the France, or rather the French, in Fashoda, and they resolved the problems, and the French left. But then Kitchener did not leave, but then got instructions to destroy the Mahdiya, in which he did in so many battles, Sennar, Shendi, and so many places. And the last battle was in Bakarat. That's where they killed that Khalifa Abdallah, who replaced Ahmed al-Mahdi. And at that time, and that happened, the confrontation happened in 1898. That was just 4 years after you, the Equatorians, have already been leased out to the Congolese. Now, and then in 1899, the British have decided to sign an agreement of what is called the condominium. Now, when you realize that when the condominium was signed, you, the Equatorians, you were still under Leopold. You are not part of Sudan. Okay. Now, the condominium ran under the British, because it was the British and the Egyptians government over Sudan. Those you call your brothers and sisters, that is the tribes of Upper Nile and Bahr al-Ghazal, were in the southern part of Sudan at the time. The condominium ran, and it's also very important for me to note to you that then until 1906, all right, while your history is with Leopold, you have a separate history, and I would recommend that fellow Equatorians and also the youth understand exactly right from 1894 until 1906 when you were under Leopold. How was the administration of Leopold over you? That's the history that you people should be knowing. Now in 1906, Leopold was summoned to be a person who violates human rights human rights principles, because the movement of the human rights was active at the time, even though the declaration was not made until 1945. He was charged with violations of human rights because he was chopping hands of people whom he thought was not hard workers. And of course that happened in 1906, and then from there he was proven guilty, and all the territories that were under him were confiscated, were taken out of his powers, and were given to the Belgians. So the Belgians started running the authority of the current part that is Equatoria. All right, the Belgians started running you guys from 1906 until 1909. All right, 1909, Leopold died. It's very important for you Equatorians and also the youth of Equatorians to understand in details what has been happening during those times. Those are your history. You got to know your history. Don't worry about the condominium. The condominium is running separate. It was running in Sudan with the people of Upper Nile and Bahr al-Ghazal attached to Sudan. You have a different history altogether. You got to know what has been happening to you starting from 1894 all the way until 1909. 1909, you were already under the Belgians. You are under the Belgians from 1906 to 1909, but under Leopold from 1894 all the way to 1906. That is a completely different history altogether, not with Sudan. And it's very important for you guys to know that history, so that your children would know exactly who they are, so that we will not be lost to think that the people with whom we are trying to hold friendship with whom we want to see as family are really our people. No. It's very important for you to know that. Now, when Leopold II died in 1909, fellow Equatorians, then what has happened was, the following year, that was in 1910, the British then came to the Belgians and presented to them the agreement that they signed with Leopold and said, we want the administration of this place. This is the part that was formerly called the Lado Enclave, in which part of it is now Equatoria. Said, we want the administration of this place because we had an agreement with Leopold that he will be running this place until his lifetime. As soon as he dies, then we will take over. And I want to assure you that any time before this place was even leased to Leopold II, you have never been under administration of what is called the Sudan. Never. Even the Taco Egyptians, when they came, they have not even established any administration over you. They only came and collected slaves. And we were organized in groups, in tribes. And there are some few kingdoms around that place. We had always been referred to as the tribes of the Upper Nile Basin. And when the term Upper Nile was used, it was used as the area of the Upper Nile Basin is the entire area where the Lake Victoria is, because that is the origin of the Nile, and the lower Nile is you're going towards the Mediterranean Sea, towards Egypt, because the Nile flows that direction. So that is the lower Nile. The Upper Nile is this one, towards Uganda, the area which is called Uganda right now. And before the Berlin Conference, the territories were not drawn, so they used to be referred only the tribes of the Upper Nile Basin. So it's very important to know these things, fellow Equatorians. Now, when you realize that your history is completely separate from the history of these people with whom we are now attached and with whom you are not able to untie your minds that we are not brothers and sisters, and therefore nationalism is just fallacious. I want to remind you a very important aspect. In 1910, the British were able to withdraw you from the authority of the Belgians, and they started administering you. But it's very important also to realize that when you're being retrieved off from the Belgians, you are not annexed to Sudan. You are administered separate under a separate governor, Arthur Witherhead, who was also British, because the British were not only running the Sudan, they were running the Sudan all the way, including the territory which is called Uganda right now. In Uganda, there used to be a gentleman by the name of Winston Churchill. The British ran it. They administered it. So they administered us separate. But at what point did we even come to become South Sudan? It was a project from 1920 to 1928. I will explain to you in a bit. I just also want to hint to you that starting from 1913, Kanfi Hurubat, there have been a lot of fights, tribal fights. The Aringa, the Lugwara, the Kakwa, the Bari, you see. And I'm sure some of the tribes of the eastern side also did confront the administration of the British at that time. They didn't want the British protectorates. They didn't want protectorates. All those local leaders were fighting, calling for freedom of their own people. So the British said, okay, what we are going to do is, we will give you guys what is called the freedom that you guys were calling for. But before we do that, we have to construct you into a state so that you'll be able to run something more of a republic. So they started a project. They started putting what is called the Equatoria Corp, you know. You had some Christian mission societies came and started putting schools. They were basically building what is called a state nation of the Equatoria, so that then they will give you independence. And the promise was that it was signed, by the way, by the chief of the Lugwara, Agofi. It is a title of a chief at the time. That you will be given independence in 1960, but they need to organize you into what is called a republic, into a state nation, so that you will be able to run a republic. But as they were doing this, it's very important, brothers and sisters, to make your own research and to understand all this. And as they were doing this, as the British were doing this, and they were doing it separate from Sudan, they were running Sudan also separate under the condominium. Let us not mix it. The fact that we like to mix the history is not good. Ours was completely separate. And as they were trying to build a state nation of the Equatoria, that process got interrupted by the World War I that broke off in 1914. All right? The World War ended in 1919. And when the World War ended, the British realized that they were economically affected. That was one. Second, they also realized something very important. That if they now construct the state nation of the Equatoria and try to give it independence in 1960, and they were also soon, eventually, giving independence to Sudan. How about the tribes that were of the South Sudan at the time? That was the tribes that are currently of the Upper Nile and Bahr al-Ghazal. What were they going to do with those tribes? Were they also going to form a state nation of those people and give them also an independence? Or are they going to be left inside Sudan? It became a question to be dealt with. And those people, by characteristics, are not even like the Northerners. So that has made the British to decide to include those people into Equatoria. All right? The tribes of the southern part of Sudan, that is the people whom come from what is called the Upper Nile of today and the Bahr al-Ghazal of today, those regions, were then included into the project of forming the state nation of the Equatoria. The inclusion policy. And that was done in 1920 through what is called the closed district policy. In the closed district policy, what the British really did was they closed free movement of the northerners into these territories of the Upper Nile and Bahr al-Ghazal. They closed those borders, and then they opened the borders of these territories of the Bahr al-Ghazal and Upper Nile into Equatoria, so that these people will then socially come into interaction, all right, so that they will institutionalize, if possible intermarry, okay? And then what they did was they also included these two into what is called the Equatoria Corp. And as they were including them into what is called the Equatoria Corp, of course the Equatoria Corp will take a different shape. It will no longer be Equatoria Corp. And that is pretty much at the creation of what is called the South Constituent. You see? So now, have you realized that the First World War came in and interrupted the process of what is called the formation of the state nation of Equatoria? Now, the formation of the state nation of Equatoria now has evolved into what is called the creation of the Southern Constituent. Now, by the inclusion of those tribes. Now, those tribes are getting included. Now, indeed, of course, it was a process also. And the process ended all the way in 1928 with a conference being held in Rajaf, which is called the Rajaf Conference. Now, to decide on which languages are going to be used as national languages, because those people are very diverse. They come from different tribes. Now building up what is called the language system that is going to be embraced there, that is going to be taught in schools. All right. So Rajaf Conference basically is the first time that we are meeting as South Sudanese. Now no longer as Equatorians. Now, have you realized how the Equatorians are now getting kind of dissolved? And also the people of Upper Nile and Bahr al-Ghazal are also getting included. Now we are kind of administratively getting melted, even though by social constructions, these people are not even able to melt very well. But administratively, we are now being brought together. So by the Juba Conference in 1928, basically, the Southern Constituent is getting formed. And the Northern politicians have become to realize that, oh, it looks like the British are at a verge of creating that part of a country, which is the Southern Constituent, and maybe down the road give them even their own independence, completely out of the North. And you got to remember that the Egyptians in 1924, that is in the middle of all this process, they were allowed to leave. They had to leave. They left. They went back to Egypt, because the British were already planning on giving what is called independence. Now, instead of planning on giving the independence to Equatoria as they were building the state of Equatoria, now the tribes of the Upper Nile and the Bahr al-Ghazal were included. Now the Southern Constituent has been formed. Now the argument has changed from giving independence to Equatorians to giving independence of the South from the North. Makhala Southern Constituent has been formed. Now, this process has also been interrupted in 1936 by the outbreak of the Second World War. You see, the same process that has happened in the first, when Equatorians were about to be given, when the construction of the state nation of Equatoria was going, it was interrupted by the First World War. Now Southern Constituent has been formed. Now, the Southern Constituent was at a verge of getting constructed with their own state. So that the British form what is called the state nation. So that when they are giving independence, they will give independence, the power goes to the state. But the process was also interrupted by Second World War. And the Second World War ended in 1945. And when the Second World War ended, the British authorities realized that, oh, now economically, they are not that strong. And during this Second World War, the process was interrupted. They had to focus with the Second World War. Now, they have not constructed an economic base for the South. So now the question that starts looming around their mind is, if they give the Southerners independence at that time, will the Southerners really be capable of looking after themselves without even a strong economic base? Or will they fall apart and just tear down into those pieces of tribes that were put together? So they changed their mind from giving independence to South. Then they came up, they orchestrated a plan. Now look, somebody's interrupting. They orchestrated a plan, all right, that, oh, you know what, we should just leave these Southerners with the North. But it has to be done through a plan. They went to Cairo and organized a meeting there and orchestrated a plan of the Juba Conference. It was prearranged that we'll have one assembly that is in the central, in Sudan, in Khartoum. So Juba Conference was just a show, which was performed in 1947. It was conducted in 1947, in which, in the Juba Conference, there were also 6 delegates from the Equatorians, 2 from Upper Nile, 2 from Bahr al-Ghazal, constituted 10 delegates to went and vote. It was 3 days. The first day, the voting went well in favor of separate assembly. All right, the Southern delegates said we want our own assembly. That is basically calling for separation. But then things did not work out well, because that night there were 2 gentlemen who went around buying off these delegates, and the second day it was a different result. Majority of the delegates said they want to have what is called one assembly, and that result was taken, and that was how Sudan ended up being with the northern part of Sudan as one country. Now, it's very important for you Equatorians to realize that for a reason. Because one, you will come to realize that all along you have not been part or sharing what is called so much with the people, with the tribes that are coming from the Upper Nile and with the tribes that are coming from the Bahr al-Ghazal. You have not been sharing much with them. You will realize this. That is for one. The second thing you realize is that South Sudan did not exist as a state nation because the process was interrupted by the Second World War. The same way Equatoria did not exist as a state nation because the process was interrupted by the First World War. But then the question here is, how did South Sudan qualify to have a referendum? If South Sudan could qualify to have a referendum in 2011, then Equatoria would qualify to have a referendum anytime soon. If you are able to analyze things in that way, then you will come to realize that a case for referendum of the Equatoria is possible anytime soon if it is addressed in the international arena very well, and if we can conduct what is called a unilateral referendum. And we will be able to do that. It's not very complicated. It's not very complicated. Fellow brothers and sisters, with the help of the Equatoria Advocacy Foundation, we are going to be putting what is called a case for a referendum. All right, we'll be putting up a case for a referendum, and the Equatoria Advocacy Foundation is open to inclusion of Equatorians. We have always been open. We want Equatorians to come in. We want to build this together. We want to march together. We want to walk alongside. Okay? Equatoria Advocacy Foundation does not intend to lead. We want to walk side by side. All right? And together know exactly where we are going. All right? And of course, I ended up the story where we all ended up becoming one assembly with the North, and that was how just we ended up becoming one Sudan. And of course, from there, you know the history. You know the history. After a couple of years, some politicians of the South now, of course, right now we do not have any Equatoria. Now we are talking about the South. some politicians of the South started saying, oh, you know what, we are not even comfortable with this one assembly, and started arguing here and there, and then started forming what is called the Anyanya One movement. When independence was given in 1956, it was when already some people were in the bush. And that continued until brought Hakuma Bitat 1972 Bitat Addis Ababa Agreement. Let me leave it there for that history. But let me just continue to analyze on the area of the case of a referendum. Now, fellow Equatorians, here is what I think. What I think is you should invest more, and the youth, especially the youth. The youth should invest more time in understanding how Equatoria has been since 1894, when they were leased out to Leopold. It was in an exchange to a strip. There's a space that the British needed to use as they wanted to build a railway through that strip all the way to Cairo, which of course ended up even not being built because the person died. That was Cicero Rhodes, who was buried in the current Zimbabwe, who used to be and it used to be called Rhodesia because of his name. It's good for you Equatorians to know about yourself starting from 1894 to 1910. From 1894 to 1910, as you were with the people of under Leopold II, then under the Belgium. Do you even know about those history? If not, why not? It's better to know that part more than anything else, because I've realized that يعني في بلبسة في وهمات كتير. What Equatorians know is they will talk about the Turco-Egyptians kida, but this year they will talk about the Anglo-Egyptians, okay, which is the condominium, and then they will leave all this big part of history bitam. This is not good. They are history bitakon. How comes you don't know it? History bitakon al jet the babdam in 1894 to 1910. You must know exactly how you have been. Even include, I know, simple example, it I know area algina gali bungure. Area algina gali bungu bita barede. Language bita bungure jaminwen. Dema language ta Bangala. Mana to feel. Sir? It's a place where elephants used to be Malian. Mahdi used to call it Dar el Fil. Google ita kangagara eta bagara Durfil, zeta bagara Durfil, lakin it's Dar el Fil. It used to have a lot of elephants. Do you know that? Well, it's because you have not been paying attention. Look at most of those rivers. The areas bit at Central Equatoria hinak, Asami bitam, Asami to Congo. You have a history that you have not known, that you need to teach your children, that you also need to know about yourself. So that, I'm not against nationalism. But if you want this nationalism, you should embrace it by first of all knowing facts, knowing about your history and nationalism. It is your choice, and you know why you are choosing it. Don't just stick on it simply because you are ignorant of yourself. I hope I'm making sense. Halas, let me end here. Kalana majuru to will. Messages are to will sometimes become confusing. Brothers and sisters, I hope this short message has given to you clearly how you would see, how you are able to now see that you and Gabail bitat region bitat Upper Nile and Bahar al-Ghazal, you are not one. To begin with, you are not one. That is why culturally they are different. Ita kanga nas bitam algina diga limut sakhafinde indum culture bitat Arabs, too into Arabic and indum sakhafat bitat nas North del Shuea. And when you look at you people Equatorians, nas ditakon alta wanga and kaanu mut sakhafindel most of them are Western cultured. You see, you got to know these small things. You are not really that one. All right, and at a point you should also realize that at a point around 1920 there was an inclusion of those people into you. The project of creating what is called a state nation to be given an independence was of the Equatorians. That's why Tokoin Bitat Equatoria Corps was formed. All right, and the agreement was agreed upon ma chief Bitat Lugwara Agofi around 1914 to 1915 Hinaken. All right, and then around 1920 to 1922, when the closed district policy was getting implemented, that was actually inclusion bitat Gabail, bitat Hajal Ginadi Bahar al Ghazal and Alanil into what is called the Equatoria Corps, into what is called the formation of the state nation of Equatoria. It is the inclusion of those people. It's the inclusion of those people into what is called Equatoria. Now, it will be ashaming today or tomorrow in the history, Al Assassino Equatoria will end up being marginalized into Masalam settlers coming from Bahar al Ghazal and from Bor or Ajad Bashikil Zed. That will be very ashaming, which seems to be happening right now. Yani imagine somebody who has been included into you is now dispersing you out, and now you're going to East Africa. So fellow brothers, issue bitana bitat self-referendum there is very serious. We have to build ourselves in knowledge of ourselves, focus on history bitakun, focus on ideas bitanat bitat asbab al-anna jura more for referendum. All right, laanu the state has already failed. Hajat al-biga gahasil fi Junub Sudan, gahasil nas bitakun in particular, and the state is not even there to take care of what is called governance. Why do you continue to hold into a dead state? It is failed, it has collapsed, finished. There is nothing we can talk about it. We have to think about building ourselves, our own state, the state nation of the Equatoria. And then we are going to start lobbying the West only to support the result. But at a unilateral referendum that we are going to come up with, and we lay down that unilateral referendum, we will hold it. Most of the diasporans, Ladi fi East Africa, Ladi fi Kenya, everywhere, Mahalat Alfogos Equatorians will make sure those ballots are there. Now, when the result comes out, if the West, including America especially and British, when they support that result, halas, hallelujah. Thank you very much. God bless you. And we'll meet again in some other video sessions, by the way. God bless you.